While we get started and wait for all the attendees to join us, I wanted to make sure that everybody knows that there is English-Spanish translation available for this webinar. You can join it by clicking on the little globe option at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll switch to Spanish for a second to give the same information. Buenos días a todas y a todos. Quería asegurarme de que supieran de que contamos con traducción simultánea al español usando el globito, la función del globito que se encuentra debajo en el menú de Zoom. Okay, I think it's a good time to get started. As I said earlier, good morning and good afternoon, good evening for everybody joining us from around the globe. My name is Masaya Llamaneras Blanco. I am an executive committee member of Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, DAWN. And DAWN, together with our friends from the Center for Economic and Social Rights, CESR, welcomes you to this conversation that we have entitled Pandemic Austerity, Southern Feminist Perspectives on the Costs of the Pandemic and Who is Bearing the Brunt. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated already existing multidimensional crises. Now that we're well into the third year living with it, the policy transformations that have followed are becoming clearer. Despite the IMF's early invitations to, quote unquote, spend and keep the receipts, policy prescriptions are now centering fiscal constraint and debt reduction. Austerity is on the rise, and feminists, especially feminists from the global south, are well aware of the fact that it is women, girls, the poor, and racialized groups that will be wearing the brunt. In fact, we already are. We learned the lesson in the 1980s and the 1990s, when it was our labor and our bodies that buffered part of the blows of the structural adjustment programs. We're deeply concerned about the consequences of this new crisis, which is taking a deep toll in our health, education, and labor protection systems. So the time is ripe to discuss these issues. Joining us today will be Busi Sibeko, Dzifa, Torvikey, and Dr. Daniele Bobb, presenting their research on the policy transformations that have taken place in Ghana, in South Africa, and Barbados in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our conversation today is part of the results of the Policy Transformations project that we have been working on in DAWN for over a year, analyzing the policy and political changes that have taken place in the global south in the context of the pandemic. We will also be counting with the comments and discussions shared by our friends Sashki Rai and Kay Donnell, who are part of CESR and are at the forefront of global struggles against austerity and for an economic system that is centered on human rights. So what we will do today is that we will go over the specific cases that I have just named, focusing on the question on how has austerity been part of the policy responses to the pandemic, also in Ghana, South Africa, and Barbados, and also thinking about what are the alternatives, the feminist alternatives that we envision from those contexts. Joining us first is Dzifa Torvikey, who is presenting a case that she also wrote together with Silvia Morfeco. Dzifa is a research fellow from the Institute of Statistical, Social, and Economic Research at the University of Ghana. And she will be joining us from Accra. Dzifa, the floor is yours. We know that Dzifa was having trouble with her connection and her power because they went through a storm yesterday. I'm wondering if her connection is failing. Dzifa, do you know, maybe you're muted? Hi, Dzifa. We can't hear you well. Can you hear us? Okay. So it seems to me that Dzifa is having trouble with her connection. Maybe we should switch things around and give her some time to get connected. Are you? Let's see. Thanks for your patience, folks. Well, I think that Dzifa is still having technical problems. If that's okay with you, Busi, would you mind starting us off with the South African case?
Sure. I think I hear Dzifa in the background, okay. Or somebody in the background. Sorry for... Oh, there her video's on.
All right.
It's like, how many years into the pandemic and these internet issues are still tells you a lot about humanity. But I don't know if I should wait because I know that Dzifa's only got 12% of battery.
Yes, let's see. Dzifa, are you there? Okay, I think we should start with South Africa's case, Busi. Dzifa, when you're ready, just join us in the chat and we'll have you after the South African case, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll start. I'm just gonna share my screen. Thank you for having me here. It was definitely a pleasure to participate in this policy transformations project or program. I'm not sure how you call it, but it's really been great being part of it. And just to give our listeners kind of an overview about this particular case study that I had written for Dawn, was really around South Africa's social assistance program. And of course, as some people might know, South Africa is one of the countries that is considered to have a well-established social assistance program, which is really derived from our constitution as a country. And our constitution came into effect or post-democracy, and our democracy was in 1994. And why South Africa is a special case is because it has demonstrated how an emerging or developing country can, through its fiscus, provide social assistance to the population. And this was even prior to the pandemic. And so the question really was about, prior to the pandemic, where were we? And when the pandemic hit, how did the South African government respond to the crisis using the existing infrastructure around social assistance? And so to first note, really, to say that despite the fact that South Africa had a well-established social assistance program, it had a long-standing gap for those between the ages of 18 and 59, and particularly for Black and colored women and youth. And when I say colored, it is a South African term, so not to be extrapolated into different contexts. And so with these group of people, so Black women, youth, and people, particularly people between the ages of 18 and 59, were really largely excluded for a variety of reasons. So the constitutional mandate, as I started off by saying, is that everyone has the right to have access to social security, including if they are unable to support themselves and their dependents. So you can imagine how in the crisis moment, how important this became, because you've got lockdown. That meant that for 3 weeks and then extended, people were not able to go to work. So if you were a non-essential worker and you were not in an environment where they would pay you while you were off work, it meant that you really needed the social assistance in most cases, especially if you did not have an already existing income base. And so the grants, though, before the pandemic, so starting by building from there, that existed was the old pension grant, the social relief of distress grant, the disability grant. And I think the names are self-explanatory, so I won't go too much into it because we only have 10 minutes. The foster care grant, care dependency grant, and the child support grant. And I think it's important for me to note here that the grants that relate to children are significantly lower than the other grants. And also to note to people that all the existing grants fall below the minimum wage. So South Africa implemented a minimum wage program in 2018. And all these grants, generally, even if a family, 1-2 people are receiving the grants, still would fall below the minimum wage of one individual. And why did the grants exist in South Africa to begin with? It is because of this historic, dispossession, economic inequality that existed long before and has reproduced itself over time. And so, we start with the expropriation or exploitation of Black labor. So Black men working in mines and getting very, very low wages. Black women being left at the Bantu stands, which is where Black people lived, taking care of children. And how has this reproduced itself? It means that women have been excluded and continue to be excluded from waged work over long periods of time. Black women in South Africa do have the highest unemployment rate in our country, and this is a historical factor. And colored women as well have a significantly higher unemployment rate because of this. And so we have to understand how income and wealth is distributed in a certain way, which is reproducing income inequality primarily, which is what social assistance is meant to deal with. And I explicitly say income inequality because if we talk about poverty as a whole, we'd have to discuss the basic services and so forth, which are still poor to some extent in our country. But in terms of social assistance, it is critical because of this deep income inequality that we have in this country, this deep unemployment that we have in this country. And I think recent stats are showing us that we're edging closer and closer to half of our population not being employed, working age population. And with youth, when you look at the youth statistics, it is actually 7 out of 10 youth are unemployed, right? These are people who are young and are going to reach 30 soon, having never worked. And so you have to think about social assistance in that context. So because of the crisis, it meant that our government had to respond. And this again is in our constitution. It says that relief during crisis has to be made available through state provisioning. And this is very important because it's legally binding. The constitution is the supernatural law in our country. So it had to be provisioned. And even though, so what happened is that our government announced the 500 billion package because of course they have to provision it. It is in the constitution that they have to provision assistance. And they provide this assistance, and 50 billion, which is 10% of the 500 billion, actually is allocated to social security. So already there we are seeing something about how we, if we were to put it on a hierarchy, how important social assistance is considered to be in the package. Then again, is 50 billion even enough in the context of a crisis, which is important to consider, right? So this package is being announced in a context where South Africa was already in an austerity place, right? There's already austerity logic that is defining how this package must be designed and how it must be implemented. And it is actually this logic that leads to only 202.6 billion, which is less than half of this package, being implemented by July 2021, which is over a year after the announcement, right? So there's a reason this logic is seeping into various programs. Why in the credit guarantee scheme, which is a significant proportion of this package, why is it that such a little bit of it is utilized to help businesses? Because it's a credit scheme as opposed to giving people money. And of course, why is business important? Because people work in business and people derive their incomes from businesses. And so if you don't save businesses, what happens? You don't save jobs. And if you don't save jobs, it means that people's incomes are further impacted. And I'm going to go into the social security component shortly, but to say that there's already austerity logic that is driving the design and of this package to begin with. And so in this 50 billion, what did we initially get, right? This is very progressive, in fact. So South Africa implemented an SRD, so social relief of distress. And even though this existed in a way before, this was different because it was a COVID SRD and was expanded to the 18 to 59 group that were unemployed. And as I noted earlier, this is a group that was traditionally not covered. So this was really a progressive measure in our country. Was 350 Rand enough? Not at all. The food package in South Africa, the basic package of food is about 4,000 Rand for a family. So this is not even 10% of that, right? But it was some sort of money, income that was provided to families. But I think it's important for me to note here that there were emerging issues with this 350 Rand. So when it was initially rolled out, it actually excluded caregivers. So if you were a mother who had children who were beneficiaries of a grant, you weren't able to apply for this grant, which was in a way discriminatory because you are still an unemployed person. And in fact, the child grants are for the children. They are the beneficiaries, not you. Yet women were excluded. And so after a while, this was changed. So they changed the criteria, which then later stage, they changed the criteria to allow for caregivers. But even that, it took great massive activism from civil society and other actors to say, hey, you are excluding women. And it's really sad because South Africa was one of the first few countries in the world to consider gender responsive budgeting. Yet here we are, and this is not necessarily something that is built into the design of the program. And with this COVID-19 SRD, it was in a stop-start manner. And the reason for that is because, again, this austerity logic of, can we afford it? No, we can't. We can't say to people, we're going to promise this for the next 3 years, or we're going to promise it until the crisis ends. It was a matter of, oh, no, we can't afford more. So there were times where this program actually ended, and it took a lot of activism for it to be reinstated. And during those periods where it ended, people do not have access to that income. The caregiver's allowance is very interesting because I think feminist economists have been long interested in this idea of how do we compensate unpaid care work. And so the caregiver grant was saying, if you are living with children in your household or who are beneficiaries of Social Security already, you're going to get an allocated amount to help you in the taking care of these children. And that is a fascinating idea. It's a very progressive idea in our country, although I have to note that I do not think that it was deliberately made through a feminist lens, as opposed to saying we cannot increase every child's grant by X amount, right? It was made to reduce, in fact, because it was per family. So if you have 5 children, then you're only getting 300 Rand. If I have 1 child, I'm getting 300 Rand. And of course, there's disproportionate impacts for that. So, and then the third is that all other grants were increased by 250. So you can imagine, linked to the previous notes, you couldn't increase 250 Rand, or not that you couldn't, but the choice there was we can't increase every grant for every child by 250 Rand. So how do we create a mechanism that is different? And so you'll notice here on this particular slide that these are showing, and I'm going to wrap up because I know I'm running out of time, that most of these were between May and October. But I have to note that the COVID-19 SRD grant, which is number 1 there, was extended over and is currently in effect as we speak until next year, although there's a lot of other issues with it. So really to say that the austerity logic really hampered or has hindered the ability to implement really progressive ideas at a large scale. So the ideas were there, caregiver grant. The ideas were there. How do we provide social security to people between 18 and 19? How do we take seriously non-waged families? The ideas there, but the implementation and the scaling were off. And why is that? Just because time and time again, our National Treasury has told us that we cannot afford it. But always, of course, the critical question is, can we afford not to do it? And that is always the big question. And in this current crisis, we saw last year the July protests. We've had 2 rather big events that have happened that have shown us that we actually really need to take social security seriously. So first, it was the violent protests that happened last year in July, where a number of businesses were looted. It's conflated, could be political, economic, many things that are happening in this protest itself, but it is really signaling something about where people are and really how this destitution that is there and people really suffering in this political dispensation that we live in, which people expected would come with economic dispensation, which has not really happened. And now we've just come out of the Durban floods, where really many people have been impacted and hundreds of people have died. And now you're experiencing another crisis with social assistance is really, really needed. And when all of this was happening, the Department of Social Development released a paper that said, how do we think about a comprehensive social security program? And of course, this was really contested. But I think, fundamentally, just to say what really are the alternatives in a minute, because I know I'm over, is to say that we really need a different macroeconomic program. We need to rethink economics holistically, to think about social assistance as being part of our developmental agenda, particularly in a context where so many people are in the non-waged economy, particularly in a context where historically it's meant certain people have not been able to participate in the waged economy and therefore remain outside of that wage economy. And this is being reproduced continuously. I think we need to think about ongoing responses. The pandemic is not over. And even though a lot of these responses have ended, it is almost like we're pretending there's no big elephant in the room. And I think lastly to say that importantly, we have to stay true to the Constitution, because the constitutional mandate is not about only people below the age of 18 and people over 59 should have social assistance. It says everyone must have social assistance. So in our economic planning and implementation, how do we take that seriously and ensure that we are planning for everyone to have social assistance. And this is obviously specific to South Africa. Some countries don't have constitutions of this nature, and maybe thinking about in those places, the legislative means to allow for commitment like this from government. So we need to use our civil society broadly, researchers. How do we really plan for and implement our constitution as envisioned by the broader society? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Busi. You leave us with lots of food for thought. I in particular took a question from you about the issue around the issue of affordability and how can we, if we can at all, afford not to increase social spending and increase social protection mechanisms in moments of crisis like this one. In the rush of changing a little bit our agenda, I did not introduce you. I will briefly say that Busi Sibeko is an economist and a researcher that holds a Bachelor of Science degree from Duke University and a Master's in Political Economy of Development from SOAS and University of London. Very relevant to her talk today, she was co-chair of the Budget Justice Coalition, which is compromised by more than 14 civil society organizations and considers herself a feminist political economist in training. Thank you so much, Busi. And now we're going to move into Dzifa Torvikey's talk, specifically focused on the policy transformations that took place in Ghana in the context of the pandemic. Dzifa, can you hear us?
Yes, Masaya, can you hear me?
Sure, welcome.
Oh, thank you. So my video will be off. So our work on school feeding program is to look at how much of the social reproduction responsibilities the state is willing to take, and what's happened in the during the crisis, especially the beginning of the crisis, how the state managed that. So in Ghana, school feeding is in some schools, public schools, many public schools, and the aim of the school feeding program is to feed children and to retain them in school, and also to help poor households to manage the food insecurity. So in 2020, from March, when schools closed down in Ghana, one would have thought that the state will think about how these children could be fed. Although there were talks about social policy, and the state did a few things. Many of them were very universal, like subsidies, not targeted. Everyone, including the rich, benefited from electricity and water subsidies for a short time. But the more lasting ones, like school feeding, were put on the back burner. So you realize that at the time, the same household, especially many of these households are also informal sector, hit by COVID, and also in terms of socioeconomic status, they are poorer, have to endure the crisis in this way. So children from these households and have to now find other ways of feeding. So when we went to the field at the time, we realized that the impact of the school feeding itself on household is not only even about food. It's also about the labor dimension, the reproductive labor. So, for instance, women were talking about how school feeding helped them to use their labor to cook breakfast or lunch. So, for instance, when the state decided to shut down school for 9 months, the feeding aspect of the program is stopped until schools reopen. And so the burden on the households to feed the family and shifted to women. The shift was also in terms of the labor that women have to use. and the monies that they have to use to feed the children. And so some of the impacts include the increased child labor in the household. So people talked about the fact that they have to now put their children to work so that they can feed the household. But that aspect of the austerity of pausing the school feeding program while it was already budgeted for, it's also talk about the accountability, because nobody told us what that money was used for. And then it beats our imagination that it's monies, the budget for children. And that budget, if it's used, also affect women, which they use for other things. For other things. So we've been thinking about we going on, we realize that the school feeding program has continued to no transformation, and it is becoming worse. In what sense? We have increased inflation in Ghana right now, and the same amount, less than $1 that's allocated to a child for a long time is the same amount that is allocated for the school feeding program. So there's the erosion of what the school feeding caterers even gets. So we're asking how the state can do this better. The alternatives are many. The communities themselves that we visited said, for instance, that from their perspective, that there could be community feeding programs based in communities. So they themselves can handle, the state brings the budgets. But then the increased spending, the state is spending, but it's not spending in social policy areas and policies that affect children and households. It's spending in areas that affect governments to expand its own regime in terms of repression, but not in areas that affect households. There'll be budgets, people who talk about budgets and how budgets can benefit everyone, especially in social spending. But because of our debt crisis, we are in a very high debt situation. The state is trying to explain why some areas of social policy cannot get more funding and why it will not expand. They will not expand. Currently, school feeding program, caterers have been advocating for an increase in the amount allocated per child so that the children can be fed better. But there's no response right now. I think from here, it's more advocacy that could do this, because the state is adamant. And our proposals about increased spending is not the state is not hidden to the advice, because currently the state has also instituted many more taxes. In fact, many of these taxes also affect the school. There are taxes now on gas, hygiene and sanitation, and we also have taxes on consumables. So at the end of the day, for us in Ghana, it's increased advocacy and pressure. We need civil society organizations such as the Net Right for Women's Organization, who is an umbrella body in Ghana that champions women's economic justice and other areas, to work together to put more pressure on the states to increase the funding for the school feeding program and other such social policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dzifa. I know it's been a very tricky day to be connected. We're very glad to have had you be able to speak despite the storm and the problems with the electricity. Now we have one more conversation one more talk to have before we jump into our questions and discussions, and also the commentary from our friends from CESR. We will now jump into Barbados. From Africa, we're now flying into the Caribbean, focusing on the particular context of Barbados. Dr. Daniele Bobb will be presenting her work that she led together with Leanne Worrell. Dr. Daniele Bobb is a researcher interested in gender and development, social policies, mothering, and women at work. She holds a bachelor degree in psychology and political science, a master's in political science from the Cave Hill campus. She's involved in many outreach and research projects in the areas of youth empowerment and marginalization of vulnerable groups. And she's steadfast in her devotion to the work for gender equity and enhancing the quality of life for everybody. Danielle, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Messiah. And it was so refreshing to hear the presentations coming from the other presenters and researchers this morning. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you who are joining us. It's great to have you here. It's morning in Barbados, so forgive me if I say morning, but I am presenting this morning the research done by myself and my colleague, Ms. Leanne Worrell, who is also here in the virtual platform and will be assisting with any questions or further comments. And we're looking at the topic Barbados, social policies in times of COVID-19, analysis of the Adopt Our Families program, and the increase of minimum wage. So the objective of the overall project was really to evaluate Barbados's policy changes during the pandemic and to try and make meaning of these impacts. And what we did was, using the proposed analytical framework by John, was to really hypothesize that Barbados's social protection response is indeed path dependent, and it has some elements of potentiality for being transformative, with avenues for gender and social justice policies in the future. But for this specific short 10-minute presentation, I want to just share with you the way in which austerity formed part of the policy responses to the pandemic in Barbados, and some of the alternatives that we envisioned coming out from the research. So to do this properly, I need to situate Barbados, or just a little bit of background on the country. It is a high income service economy, mainly focused or reliant on tourism. And like most small island developing states, especially in the Eastern Caribbean, we are very vulnerable to climate change, to rising sea levels, to other atmospheric pressure and other weather pattern changes specifically. Now, this was demonstrated for us last year when we were affected by the Lasso Frere's explosive volcanic eruption in our neighboring sister island of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which occurred in April. And then following that in July, we had Hurricane Elsa. Now, some of the main contributors to the economy is tourism, financial services, and construction. But those were negatively affected by the 2009 global financial crisis, which culminated in our 2018 economic recession. And so in 2018, Barbados entered an International Monetary Fund program operating under the framework of the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Plan, or what we locally refer to as BERT. And this fell under the Extended Fund Facility of the IMF. Now, in this fund, and I think this is where the Prime Minister was very forward-thinking and transformative in her vision, what they sought to do was to include some objectives which really focus on policies that reflect the government's alignment of its anti-poverty and sectoral strategies with sustainable development goals, particularly in the area of fiscal policy to achieve greater equality, as well as increase social protection access and social spending floors. Now, this plan, of course, intended to be very transformative, and it reflected several initiatives, such as we had the 5% wage increase for public servants, also an increase in the minimum non-contributory pension, increase in funding for the welfare and poverty alleviation programming. And all of that was to strengthen the social safety net in face of the impending austerity measures. For example, in 2019, we saw the retrenchment of 1,500 public workers, and over 70% of whom were women. So particular attention for us as researchers was given to Barbados' debt restructuring process since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we looked at two particular policies, the Adopt Our Families program, as well as the increase in minimum wage, which happened during the pandemic, because we found that it was a really interesting case in how the government attempted to provide a social safety net for working class citizens. Now, the minimum wage took effect on April 1st, 2021, and it is set at $4.25 US generally, and for security guards, the hourly rate is $4.63. The previous minimum wage was at $3.13 US, and that only applied to shop assistants. This particular minimum wage included other workers, so domestic workers, gas station attendants, security guards. But for us, again, the analytical questions we were more interested in were who were the intended beneficiaries and what are the benefits for the states, the implication for businesses, and specifically vulnerable groups. So raising the general minimum wage would especially be beneficial for women because they make up the majority of low-wage workers, and they are the primary supporters for their families. Now, given that women head most single-parent households, the increase in minimum wage, we expect it would have a kind of a welfare positive and economically stimulative ripple effect on not just the families, but also communities and our societies. And this first was an example of how, although there was no gender analysis, no evidence of it in the implementation of these policies, this showed how the policy recognized the fact that women were the majority of low-wage workers and primarily responsible for the support of their families. The other side of that, however, is that this disproportionate minimum wage for security guards, which is really a primarily dominated occupation, also increased the gender wage gap, as men in security services in Barbados earn at least 70% more than women. And so this gender inequality was not addressed by the government, even though the closing gender pay gap was a stated manifesto goal of the government's political party. Also, the increase in minimum wage really did not address the increased unemployment rate, of which women comprise the majority. And so it was important for us to note too that minimum wage was primarily for certain jobs. And this indicated the kind of valuing of work, which really continued to guide the wages of certain professions. And so the value of jobs based on who does them, women, uneducated women, particularly working class women, and not in relation to the skills and what they require, really destabilizes the societies. And this came out more glaringly during the pandemic, because we saw in the pandemic how our societies relied heavily on this care work, whether it was paid or unpaid, which was done primarily by women, which is devalued, invisible, and in category of lower paid jobs as well, how that work became very much essential to sustaining our societies. While acknowledging that, we did have to note the transformative initiative as having this minimum wage meant that there was some degree of protection against the exploitation and underpaid positions in sectors such as domestic workers. And this protection was under the law, and it really brought to the forefront the kind of the importance of jobs, of women's work that we label and devalue, unpaid and paid work. The second program we looked at was the Adopt Our Families program, an initiative again done by the government in April 2020 as a way to kind of support families that were hardest hit during the pandemic and to form an ecosystem of social care policies meant to benefit vulnerable groups. The program began with the government injecting about $5 million into it, and then funds were generated through private sources. Citizens who were earning over 100,000 or 50,000 dollars were asked to contribute to that fund, and payments were facilitated through bank e-transfers as well as through public donations from companies who would write checks to governments, etc. And so by March 2021, that money coming from the public sector, from corporate Barbados and other individuals amounted to $5 million in the fund, whereas the government contributed $10 million to that fund. At the onset of the program, however, the idea was to assist about 1,500 families, but the program ended up assisting 5,000 families, and families became eligible for a monthly transfer of just around $300 after they applied and they went through that assessment process. And what was interesting for us to note is that the Prime Minister of Barbados noted that she was casting this wide net so that she would leave no one behind. So persons who were in mid-range and managerial positions within industries such as hospitality, airline industries, those who were hardest hit during the pandemic also had the opportunity to seek government help. And after 3 months, persons who qualified, of course, they would revisit that case to see if anyone was now hired, if situation had changed in any way. And so this commitment to social care is illustrated in how the social protection and poverty alleviation personnel constructed the category of what was referred to as the vulnerable in the cash transfer of money during the program, because they were looking now at age, health, status, disability, and how, when we look at it, what we saw was that the policy design and the implementation really did not pay attention to who is located where within the economy, because the effectiveness of it was not what was intended, right? That was not the potential that such a program had. And so while women were the ones receiving most of the support from this particular program, the policymakers didn't seem to be informed by research and evidence on women's economic realities. And so the reach, the effectiveness, the efficiency, the access, there was some issues that emerged with that. And what we also realized is that key partners, for instance, the Bureau, the Gender Bureau, were excluded from the program. And so finally, in terms of some of our considerations and what we concluded is that really the Barbados government has really demonstrated the potential for transformational policies. Barbados has a progressive woman leader, but we cannot dismiss the fact that the global political economy shapes and dictates the direction of small island developing states. And so the study concluded that while Barbados's policy initiatives during the pandemic are indeed path dependent, we found that it was too early in the life of these policies to confidently assess them as transformative and progressive, because we saw also some issues arising with funds to sustain the program, the Adopt Our Families programs. It was not sustainable, and it was halted for a brief moment. And although the intent appears to have some degree of transformation, the policies are also simultaneously reproducing inequalities among vulnerable groups, offering micro-level short-term gains for the benefit of the larger economy. And so we argue that these shortfalls can be addressed in part by incorporating a gendered, inclusive, intersectional analysis of all intended and present programs. As we are seeing that there are possibilities for future policy responses that are truly transformative, that are feminist, and that expand democracy and social justice. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. It was really interesting to listen to the moment of Barbados, which is a case that we look into with optimism because of the leadership of the Prime Minister, and at the same time we understand the structural constraints that the country is grappling with. So it's a case that we want to keep an eye on. Now we're going to move into the commentary and discussion, and that we will be led by our friends from CESR before we have a period of questions and answers that we invite you to think about already and start populating the Q&A box as well as the chat. The commentary from CESR will be led by Sakshi Rai and Kate Donald. Sakshi is a program officer at the Center for Economic and Social Rights. She oversees the work on global economic governance. She's a development economist with expertise in gender budgeting, very much in line with the South African case when we talked about that briefly. And she's investigating the impact of corporate tax abuse on labor rights, which also I think is a key aspect of how to think about what's coming in terms of alternatives. After Sakshi, we're going to have Kate Donald, who is acting executive director at CESR. She leads the organization's collaborative efforts to build a blueprint for a rights-based economy. Her work has focused on economic and gender inequality, tax policy, development finance, and unpaid care work. And before joining CESR, Kate worked for the UN Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights and the International Council on Human Rights Policy. So I'll leave the floor to you, Sakshi, and followed by Kate.
Thank you so much, Masaya. I will try to be as secular as I can in my greetings to you all. So, namaste, assalamu alaikum. We're going through a heat wave. First of all, I would like to thank you so much for inviting CSR to comment on these fantastic papers. I'm very delighted to be part of this fruitful discussion. Whether we look at health or economy, social security, protection, the impacts of COVID-19 are, have sort of exacerbated the inequalities that were already existing. The gradual and at times rapid shift to austerity policies, as a result of high and increasing sovereign debt, has posed challenges and in fact has hindered the implementation of new and existing social protection, almost all three of the country cases. But even the debt service suspension initiative, which sort of ended in December 2021, was extended to 73 low-income countries and left out various middle-income countries from the global south, in particular from Africa. We can see the effect of such an uninspiring initiative in at least two South Asian countries at the moment that are undergoing massive economic and that has turned into a political crisis. Coincidentally, these two countries were also the ones to refuse and to endorse the G20 OECD-led global tax agreement, because it is certainly not a coincidence that they refuse this agreement given how resource strapped they are. So, I would begin by saying that, these racial and geopolitical imbalances are being reproduced and regurgitated in how economic discussions are taking place in the international fora. And precisely, which is why it's super important to look into these case studies and place a human face to how this is affecting. I said this to our colleagues from Dawn earlier, that when I was going through the papers, it felt like I was reading about my own country. But the experiences, even though they were similar, some of them were inspiring nonetheless. I feel like out of the 3 countries, I believe the only country that actually delivered on civil society wins in using budget advocacy was South Africa, and that was, albeit inconsistently with respect to human rights outcomes, I would say was South Africa. And it was a genuinely interesting and super inspiring effort in how the civil society was able to actually use budget advocacy to get at least a part of what they were aspiring to advocate. The South African policy effort in introducing the social relief of distress grants and access to child support grants. I mean, these kind of grants, I feel perhaps are a concrete step towards a rights-based economy. I agree that they're lacking on many fronts, and it's been very well laid out by Busi's analysis, but it feels that it is definitely a great marker and a great indicator to how social security programs can actually be empowering, as some research has showed, how child support grants have positive outcomes for women's financial independence and social mobility. So I do want to highlight at this point that the rhetoric that even nationally in India, we almost always hear is that these social spending grants, create some sort of unhealthy dependency, when you never see such an argument almost being extended to large businesses that are scouring and negotiating backdoor deals on receiving massive tax breaks, which almost are always without any public scrutiny. For example, this is something that we saw even in Barbados, I would say, where, the pressure of taxes was intensified for individuals rather than large businesses or the financial sector, perhaps, which led to significant job losses, adding to the already brewing unemployment crisis, which, of course, invariably affects women who form a large part of the informal economy. And I think another great point that was brought out by Busi was the unclear and unfair implementation of gender responsive budgeting. I think a gross error that in my mind comes to when when the Indian government actually came out with a policy of affording each below poverty line household with an LPG gas cylinder in the name of the woman belonging to that household. A scheme that actually reinforces patriarchal thinking that the job of care, the job of actually cooking and cleaning is that of a woman, and yet that was actually termed under gender budgeting. So I could almost sense solidarity in there, where I felt jumping from my seat and saying I completely agree with what the South African experience has been also with respect to gender responsive budgeting. And here's my first point that I would make, that any budgeting exercise has to be conducted in a way that it moves away from the binary understanding of what gender is, and has to include caste, race, and any other discriminated social group from the stage of when the policy is being planned to when you're actually formulating the budget. The other scheme that perhaps I thought deeply resonated with me was when I was reading the Ghanaian paper and the example on the Ghanaian school feeding program. As many in the audience would already know, that India too, as I recall, back in 1995, I would say, launched a food security program, which was legally backed, which was sort of it was made a constitutional mandate where it would guarantee food security for children going to school in an effort to tackle child labor. This political commitment, of course, came on the backs of India being a signatory to the Convention on Rights of the Child. And so from all of these experiences, I feel that one thing that really did pop out for me was that I could not ignore the inherent and almost sort of pressing need for budget transparency. In Ghana, for example, you could see how there were palpitating issues with the Ghanaian school feeding program when it was actually implemented, where funds were either reallocated or repurposed from unused and underutilized funds. Usually most corpus funds that are not regularly used receive very little to no public scrutiny, and they suffer from underutilization for many, many years. So, which is why it's easier in times of emergency to actually allocate those funds, but that's not necessarily additional funding, as has been pointed out. What was very striking from the Ghanaian experience was also that there was an immediate need to expand the coverage of the school feeding program to junior high school students, apart from it covering primary school children, because these programs in particular have an impact on how many children are actually attending school, and that includes like girl children are more likely to attend school if there is a midday meal sort of a program or a national level program on school feeding. So I could definitely see so many emerging, cross-sectionalities in all of these papers. The second point I would, make here is that what came out for me in this analysis is that there is a need for policy implementation and thinking in a decentralized or rather federated manner to impact, to have a rather massive impact locally. And the third point I would, make is that, for a representative and a transparent budgetary procedure, economic and finance ministries of countries have to take gender impact assessments on tax policies, because it again is, as I said to my earlier point, that it's important to have a holistic budgetary transparent process, so that civil society and other actors could actually be a part of this and have their voices reflected in any of the policies that are being made. The fourth and the last point that I would make is, and I mean this in the context of how international financial institutions are absolutely guilty of violating constitutional commitments by states on realizing human rights of their populations. And I completely would argue that it is very crucial to explore and gather efforts between human rights and other national and international frameworks to challenge long-standing policies and practices that have absolutely led to the significant marginalization of communities whose voices anyway, are historically sort of ignored. I would now pass on the baton to Kate. I hope I was concise enough in wrapping most of these. Oh, sorry. I just saw all of the comments on my
it was fine. It was just at the very beginning, your connection was a little bit dodgy, but then it was totally fine. We could hear you, so don't worry, Sakshi.
Oh, good.
And also thank you so much to Sakshi for, it's very, very late where she is. So thank you so much, Sakshi, and being so articulate and coherent at such a late hour. I'm very impressed. Yeah, so I'm going to be pretty brief, and just like three things that really like stand out. And by the way, I really encourage everyone to go and read these three papers if you haven't already been able to read them, and the analytical framework that Dawn put forth, because they really are like very different but extremely interesting. And interesting because they have very different approaches as well as different findings in different contexts. Like, it's so interesting to see different ways that one can do like gender analysis of economic policies. So I really encourage everyone to dive into them. So my first point, building especially on what Sakshi was just saying about international financial institutions, is one thing that I found really interesting about the three papers and the presentations was the kind of the ways in which the global system kind of conditioned the responses that countries were able to make during the pandemic. And, debt was obviously one big looming issue for many of the countries, and a politicized issue as well, to be sure. And there was a great quote in the Ghanaian paper about, Ghana's economy was choking on debt, which I think is like a very visceral, but a very kind of accurate representation of what these like huge sovereign debt burdens, very unfair, in some cases, odious debt, and, very unfair terms that are imposed by creditors, most of whom are either private creditors or global north countries, or international financial institutions, are imposed on global south countries that really, really constrain their ability to spend their way out of the crisis and to put in place measures which realize human rights and gender equality. And so that was like really present in my mind as I was reading the papers. And then also, like, one thing that I found really interesting about reading these three papers together is the different relationship that each country has to the IMF. So, we have one country, which is Barbados, which is currently under an IMF program. Ghana, which has in recent years been under an IMF program. So I think 2015 to 2019, Ghana was under an IMF program. And then South Africa, which is not under a formal IMF program, but did get some emergency financing from the IMF to fund its pandemic responses. And there was a great quote as well in Busi's paper about how, like, South Africa doesn't have kind of strict loan conditions from the IMF, but she said the decision to pursue austerity reflects the internalized and normalized neoliberal agenda, which has become de facto self-enforced. And I thought that was such a powerful point, and so applicable to so many contexts, that we see that, yes, countries who are under IMF loan programs are struggling with these conditions and trying, in some cases, like Barbados, trying to put in place progressive policies, but with this constraint of their loan conditions. But even countries who aren't under IMF programs, even global north countries in some respects, are still following this like austerity logic and this austerity dogma that is really like, it really restricts the imagination for what is possible. And I'll come to that again a little bit later. The second point I wanted to make that really like came out to me from reading all these papers and listening to the presentation is this question of like, what does it mean for a policy to be gender responsive or to be human rights based? We have the example of South Africa, which has the right to social security in its constitution. And, all these policies to some extent were sold as gender responsive or kind of, empowering women. But in all these contexts and in so many others too, we see such a limited understanding of what it really means for a policy to be gender sensitive or gender responsive. Like, and for me, this is really related to the whole question of social protection and how we target it. And, we know that that in recent years, there's been a real push to target social protection more accurately, supposedly accurately and efficiently, and a real push to kind of narrow programs and focus them on certain beneficiaries. And of course, in some cases, with the right conditions in place, that can be rights aligned and can be a useful way to reach the most disadvantaged people. But in many cases, we see the opposite. Like, for example, in the Ghanaian paper, there's the statistic, a shocking statistic, that only 25% of Ghana's population is covered by some social protection program. Given the high levels of poverty in the country, that really should be a shocking figure for us all to contemplate. And we've done some work with partners in Egypt where we found similar things. Like, Egypt has big flagship World Bank supported social protection programs that are very targeted. that we found, for example, only 44% of the population that's considered poor are covered by these social protection programs. And there's a 59% exclusion error, for example, people who should be included and are not because of errors in the targeting. So we saw all sorts of issues coming up with this issue of like targeting social protection to women and sometimes reinforcing care responsibilities as a result. So this was another big question that came up for me, is like, is a targeted program that's targeted at women really more human rights responsive or gender responsive than a comprehensive universal program which reaches everyone? And so I think that's important for us to consider as we all move forward. And then just to wrap up as well, like there's so many, the current context we're in, it's so crucial that we're thinking about all of these issues, because despite the rhetoric that's coming from many governments and from the international level, like from the IMF, that, okay, the crisis is over, time to get back to business as usual, back to austerity, roll back the spending, target the social protection programs further again. We all know from our lived experience, but also from the work that we do with different people around the world, and, and just from looking at the statistics and looking at the news, that if ever there was a time to go back to business as usual, I would argue there is never that time, but if ever there was a time, it is absolutely not now. We're still in a pandemic. We're in the throes of a critical climate crisis. And now we're seeing an escalating cost of living crisis around the world, where the amount of money that people need to spend just to put food on their tables is doubling in many regions. So, if we need to seriously think about kind of what should be government's response be to this question. And, Busi talked about the kind of internalized kind of narrative and agenda of austerity. And so for us as civil society and as feminists, I think it's so crucial that we're taking time to like break down that narrative, to work together, to respond to this issue, to make sure that we are proposing new and rights-based and feminist narratives, which is something that I think this Dawn project is doing really effectively. And being able to kind of really concretely answer that question that gets thrown at us when we talk to our governments, like, oh, but how can we afford this? And actually we have the answers to that question. It's not a difficult question to answer from a feminist economist perspective, but like we need to get those answers out there and in the public mind and in those conversations with governments. So I'll leave it there because I know we're running out of time, but thank you so much everyone for the really fascinating papers.
Thank you so much, Kate and Sakshi, for this, I think, very, very enriching commentary. We're really happy to have a dialogue with you folks about the work that we're doing as Dawn as part of the Policy Transformations project. As we're waiting for questions and time and commentary in the chat and questions and Q&A box, which folks I invite you to use and put questions forward to this amazing set of speakers. I have a number of ideas and comments and rather questions for us all to think about that I'd like to invite Dzifa and Busi and Daniele to address. And they point toward these similar points as Sakshi's and Kate's comments on the ways forward, right? So we know what our feminist critiques are. We're concerned about, for example, reproducing this sexual division of labor and yes, assigning care responsibilities to women, especially impoverished and racialized women who are always carrying the load for the majority. And we also know that this is not the time for austerity, if there ever was one. We are in the moment in which we actually need counter-cyclical responses that keep the economy and society going. The big question is how, right? One thing that came to mind while listening to Danielle's presentation and while reading her work to it together with Leanne is the issue of how to fund this policy and adopt a family. The case of adopt a family in Barbados, for example, was interesting because the government put an amount of money and expected the private sector, families or corporations to add to it. And when I read that, I was wondering, why not taxing? Why not using a tax system that actually funds policies and do not rely, on the good intentions of those that can afford to do some charity? So the issue of taxes, I think, is one of the main questions that I'd like us to think about, and also the issue of debt that Dzifa's paper so clearly exposed, and how a government choking in debt can actually respond to crises like this. So thinking about tax justice and thinking about the structural issues around debt justice, what can we think as feminists, economists, and also feminist activists engage with social justice in this context? That would be my question to you three. And if it's okay with you, Busi, we'll start with you as we started the round of the talks.
No, thank you for that. And thank you for all the great feedback. I think, Kate really hits a good point there about universalized or targeted. And in South Africa, the argument has been to universalize. And there's reasons, there's practical reasons for this, right? We are a country where corruption is a real concern. Even with this 350 Rand rescue package, there were people who were receiving it who had incomes who shouldn't have been receiving it to begin with. And so what do? You just kind of roll out to everybody, because I think fundamentally as a human right, whether you work or not, you should have the basic ability to survive. So to me, the universal is appealing in that way. Does it appeal to the feminist argument? Not so much, because it just like, it's equality as opposed to equity. And what we need is that equity in our country, right? To put everybody, in a more equitable way. But to answer your question about how do we fund these? Always the hot topic. Where's the money? There are many proposals that have been made, and in the South African context for the social grants or universal basic income grant, there's been multiple proposals, specifically from the Institute for Economic Justice, where I used to work, around a wealth tax. Right, in South Africa, we've got such deep inequality, such that people are earning, or majority of our population earns so little. And in fact, in 2015, more than half of workers earned below the working poverty line. And that tells you a lot. Our GDP looks good, profits are great, businesses are making money, the wealthy are wealthy, the wealthy have been wealthy from apartheid times, right? On the backs of Black labor, are still wealthy. And so the question of a wealth tax has been one that has been on the table for a very long time. We've also proposed other measures, even including like debt in the short run. In terms of the IHA, that's what they've proposed, to say, what if we increase debt in the short run? Because remember that it's not like dropping money in a black hole, right? This money will generate some money. When people receive the social assistance, they're going to use this money in the economy. And particularly in South Africa, we need to think about what are the multipliers in the local economies as a result of spatial apartheid. So yes, we might at the macro level be like, oh, this money is just not going to make it or whatever. But in a local economy where people are buying food from the informal market, where people are buying, the massive multiplier effect in those levels, the local levels, which is where this money is needed. And so I think that's the thing, to think of it in two ways. Yes, we can tax, we can wealth tax, we can corporate income tax, we can reduce rebates for the wealthy, whatnot. But then the other part of it is to say, how does this policy itself self-finance? What VAT are we getting back from social assistance? So instead of doing the 100%, which is what we usually forced to do, is to say, okay, we can subtract 14%, 20% can be accounted for in other ways to make that argument.
Thank you, Busi. I like that idea of, how the multiplier effects of the VAT that we're getting also on the other side of the system So we get a systemic view of how the economic system can work as well. And the idea of universality is a perennial idea. I think that was a key aspect to think about. There are a number of questions in the chat. While you folks address this first question on tax justice and structural debt, I invite you to also take a look at those and answer there in case we do not have chance to include them in verbal answers as well. Dzifa, the floor is yours.
Hello. Asaya, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, so I've been reflecting on your questions about how social protection should be done. And I think one of the arguments about the kinds of social protection policies that the states has implemented, the short-term ones especially, is about the universality, and the fact that that universality also meant that there's less accountability. So the people who are supposed to benefit are also not usually the people who have the infrastructure needed to benefit from the social protection policies or the kinds of responses that the state has implemented. For instance, if you don't have electricity meter, you cannot benefit from a subsidy. If you don't have a meter, you don't have electricity in your home, which means that there are people who are outside these universal programs that do not benefit. So we argue for targeted programs. And in terms of targeted programs, the school feeding program is an example of a targeted program. It's in public schools, but it doesn't mean that children in private schools do not need school feeding program. Some will need school feeding program. But then the question about expansion and how do we fund this? The tax issues are very clear. In Ghana, anytime there's crisis like this, there's always not the case about looking at multinationals and the tax they pay. In fact, it is rather talks about making a good business environment, which also includes the fact that they are paying less tax and also giving more room to get more exploit labor. So we need to, multinational companies working in Ghana, one of the ways to get these monies to fund social protection policy is to make sure that they pay appropriate taxes, and also to plug the holes through which these taxes leave the country without those that have to stay in the country do not stay in the country. They fly out. So that's one way of funding the programs. Another way is also to have to make sure that we plug the ways in which internally the projects themselves are weakened by the political hijack of certain people, so that the real impact of the policies on the beneficiaries reach them. So, for instance, in the school feeding program, it's always political. It's the party in power that gives these kinds of contrasts to people. So they are not able to, the state itself, because it is also a political settlement of a certain kind, it's not able to even ask for accountability. If people are really fed and what they are fed, how many people are fed with the kind of money that they give. So we need accountability in two levels, the multinational companies in the country, in the gold mining, in the extractive sector, and telcos paying what they are supposed to pay, so that we are able to fund this. We don't want to go back to IMF. I would not propose that we go back to IMF for this kind of funding. We can get the money internally, and that is not, it doesn't include austerity, especially where the poor have to suffer. the money is with the multinational companies, it's also siphoned away by the political elites. And that's why we need a lot of advocacy to make sure that people account for monies that they are given. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dzifa. The issue of accountability is one that continues to pop up also throughout these discussions about where these resources come from, and also how are they really being used. Danielle?
Yes, thank you. I agree with Busi and Pisa on this. And when you mentioned tax, my heart skipped a beat because we've been having this debate in Barbados about taxes and who's being taxed. How that is important to the conversation, because Barbados just recently implemented the 1% COVID contribution levy, I think, for persons who are earning over 6,200, about 6,250 and above monthly, right? And the cost of living in Barbados is very high. In fact, it increased by about 6% during the pandemic as well. And Barbados already have a very high tax bracket for persons. So there are persons who've been arguing and complaining that there are people who are considered to be middle income earners, middle class persons, who are now being taxed so heavily that it's pushing them into this state of having to live from month to month in that regard. Like, they no longer have the kind of disposable income they had before. And so I think it's important for us to think about who's being taxed. I think it's important for us to have a context-specific discussion around this, and to understand too how the burden of care falls heavily on women. And there's a way where our economic calculations around GDP exclude the unpaid care work that sustains the economy in this regard. And so we have to think around rerouting the taxes that the government already have, how they're spending that money. And I think Kate and Sashti spoke about that transparency in it, but where the money is being spent. And so we are looking at a pandemic where women's unpaid care work sustained the economy, sustained the societies, but there's no universal household income, right? There's no way that you're contributing to those. Even if we look at the Adopt a Family program, $300 US per month it really can't do much, especially for a household where you have multiple children. They have to be at home, be in school online. They have to eat, bills have to pay, just so many things have to be done. And so taxes, I think we need to think around ensuring that those who are at the upper echelons, those who can afford it, those who have to pay it, are actually paying it, and how the government is actually assigning or allocating the resources as it comes to the money that's coming in, and taking into account what do we need to focus on? We need to focus on our social security or social safety nets. We need to focus on developing our human capital. We need to focus on our citizens, persons who are living within our countries, and our vulnerable groups in particular, which heavily comprise women. Women fall heavily in the informal sector that was drastically almost annihilated during the pandemic. Women are caring for children, for families, for dependents, yet we can't then ask that you tax them further, right? Some women can't even afford to pay for daycare. They can't even afford to pay for elderly care for their parents, and sometimes have to already choose between their jobs and their care work that they have to do. So I think we need to focus more on providing the kind of support for these persons who can then leverage from that to engage in other formal income earning activities, and think about who we are taxing, what are we taxing, and what are we using the tax for.
Thank you, Danielle. Great way to think about the redistribution of care work and how it is also a public responsibility. I think it's a reminder of the relevance of public services as well. Before we close today, I wanted to give back the word to Kate to add a few cents into this conversation as we come into a close.
And I'll be very brief, just to say I'm I learned a lot from that round of responses. I wish we could carry on this discussion for like 2 more hours. But I think I'm so glad that we've kind of ended on this issue of tax, because it is the crucial part. It is the crucial part of the answer to the question, like, how do we afford this, and how do we, because the vast majority of countries are not utilizing their tax bases to the greatest potential, and are certainly not distributing the burden of tax in the way that is most gender sensitive, feminist, or human rights responsive. And we have seen in some countries, that have been willing to generate the political will and go against, for example, the kind of wishes of multinational corporations to put in place wealth taxes or excess profit taxes. And that really needs to be the direction that we're increasingly pushing in. This is the most feminist and human rights responsive way to raise the money for these kind of programs, is to put in place much, much more progressive tax policies.
Thank you so much, Kate. I think we've learned a lot, and many key conversations came up. The idea of redistributing care and thinking of care as a public responsibility was also at the heart of a lot of our conversations. And how do we support that redistribution, and how do we avoid overburdening women and girls, especially racialized and impoverished women and girls, with the responsibility of care in a context of structural crisis. The issue of tax justice and debt justice, I think, are both issues, are burning questions that we need to tackle, and are also at the heart of the politics of what we should be doing and advocating for in the next years, because a pandemic of austerity is already in place, and is what we need to respond to. So, well, in the name of Dawn and in the name of our friends from CESR, I thank you very much for joining us. I think our panelists in particular, I give you folks a round of applause for your work. I invite you all to check out the papers, the discussion papers that we have published in Dawn's website of the Policy Transformations Project, to really go